Bublitz podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 10th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 17th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I'm excited because this is a difficult week, but I think there's some really good conversation that we need to be having, and especially as a church community, I think it's a week that we can get into some things that are a little bit more difficult to talk about, but I think also very necessary for us to be talking about. And I think that's a good place for us to be. And I think it's one of these moments that can we put some of these different pieces together and acknowledge things that are going on that maybe we don't necessarily like to talk about, but it's necessary to talk about. But before we jump into that, let's first acknowledge, one, I've been battling a little bit of a bug, so if I'm coming across and my tone is a little bit different, that's probably a little bit why. But the other thing we need to talk about is also looking back to last week's question, which was, where do you need to be persistent with your gifts? And I think this is where we can take a look to some of our elders. And I know one of our loyal listeners is definitely in that camp, and he talks about, for them, their greatest gift is helping people. And yes, that there is specific jobs that they can be doing within that. But I think also was important that they brought up was acknowledging that sometimes that can also happen outside of what our typical day-to-day work is. Specifically when they're talking about helping people, there's always people who need just a little bit of help, and making sure that we're noticing and acknowledging that. And I think that's one of the things that we have to be looking for. The different gifts that we are given is a gift, and thus we should be looking to utilize that gift and trying to figure that out. Maybe that's not in the typical way that people would think that a person with that gift would have. Maybe it's looking and finding creative ways of being able to utilize and do those things. Heck, thinking about this podcast, part of this was me being creative and figuring out how I was going to have my voice heard, I felt, in a different way on what I felt needed to be discussed and talked about within the Christian faith and science being brought up together. And I think that's a very important thing that I don't think we talk about enough. So let's just jump into it for this week. One of the Old Testament texts that you can go into is Isaiah chapter 5, the first 7 verses of it. These, like I said, are some interesting and difficult texts. And so here we get compared the tribe of Israel to a vineyard, and talking about how this vineyard is planted, it's grown, it has the watchtowers, it has all the things in which it should be successful. And yet it sprouts sour grapes. And in this type of case, the people listening to this would have known the only way to really be able to deal with wild grapes getting in is you have to burn and start over. So this idea here of how we as the people of Israel, are we going to allow ourselves the ability to be remade, to be made new, to be people of followers of Christ, and realize that we need to be brought back and made whole again. And this is going to be a long and difficult process at times for us to do. The psalm goes with that is Psalm 80 verses 1 and 2 and 8 through 9. And this continues to play on that vine type of branch idea. And especially here, recognizing that as the people of God, that we have had all this different protection and all these different things that have been placed around us to help make sure that we are successful. And yet, are we going to recognize that and acknowledge that and make sure that we go through the pruning and such that we need to within our own lives to be able to produce the fruit that we are called into producing? And so it's this idea here of recognizing that we fall short and how often then we need to be able to make the modifications that allow us to be able to move forward, and thus continuing into this vine and plant idea and making sure that we are bearing the fruit that God has called us into. And this means that we need to call upon the Lord to look for that restoration. The other alternative Old Testament text this week is from Jeremiah chapter 23, starting at verse 23 through 29. And we have to recognize here and acknowledge here how at times there has been prophets that have had dreams or had visions or help us to continue to try to pull closer to God, but yet ourselves, us as the people of Israel, fall to the wayside. And here we get this acknowledgement of how the ancestors continued to go for another god of Baal. And so this recognition on how, yes, there are people who are of God who are calling us into that, but are we going to acknowledge that God is calling and working with us, and yet we have continued at times to turn away and ignore and recognize that it's frustrating and hard for God at times too, but yet we still then have to acknowledge it within ourselves to be able to turn back and come toward God. The psalm that goes with this is Psalm 82, all 8 verses of it. And this is then a psalm of recognizing that, yes, we fall short, and recognizing that we are a needy people. We are people who are often shaken by things that shouldn't be shaking us. We turn away. And we acknowledge then in that we need to look toward God for God to be able to raise us up, to move us into the directions of where God is calling us to be. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Hebrews chapter 11, starting at verse 29 to chapter 12, verse 2. I think this is a really important text this week, and it's worth digging into a little bit here. But it goes through a lot of the Old Testament and how many times the people have had to do things by faith, and yet their faith still held them back. So the people crossed the Red Sea on dry land, but yet they were also fearing when the Egyptians were coming, and it was also God taking care of that. It was by faith that the walls of Jericho fell. It was by faith that Rahab the prostitute did not perish by being disobedient and received the spies in peace. Recognizing that in these moments, we have to continue to have faith even when things around us are in chaos, even when things appear like is going wrong, that things are destitute, things are just terrible, that we have to continue to give trust and faith to God, and that recognizing in that we are building into a greater cloud of witnesses who then will help restore us and be able to be the image of God that we are called into. So we have to continue in the faith and continue to draw near to God, continue to strive for that, even in the difficult times, even in the times where it's like, what is going on? To continue to take those steps forward. And this, to me, is a very important text, especially with what we get for the gospel text this week. And the gospel text this week then is out of Luke chapter 12, verses 49 to 56. This is not the most encouraging Jesus that we typically get. This is continuing this lecture that Jesus has had with his disciples that we've been having for the last few weeks. But it's this recognition that Jesus didn't come to give just peace on earth. That yes, in Jesus coming, Jesus acknowledges, I know there's going to be division, and goes through that there is going to be fights within families, there is going to be division amongst you, and recognizing in that that is part of what happens. And within that, then he gets to this part of where it's talking about when you have a cloud rising in the west, you immediately know that it's going to rain. And when you have winds blowing from the south, you know that scorching heat is coming. Do you not then recognize with what is going on here on earth, being able to interpret the present time? And this is kind of giving, I would say, a little bit of forbearance on where Jesus is going. They don't necessarily recognize it at the moment, but this recognition then of all these things are happening, and yet we have certain aspects where you're able to understand, but yet there's some aspects you are completely blind to and just can't fully wrap your head around. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we'll do a shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you have a checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help me give me some ideas and direction and different ways to be thinking about and looking at these texts week to week. So, if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I also highly recommend checking out the revised common lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but along with having art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, even a section to be able to go into some daily devotions to help go through these texts. I would argue it's another amazing resource if we are trying to prepare week to week for what worship is bringing and going to give us and being able to get more out of that service. Make sure that you're spending a little bit of time going through these texts and preparing. It's an amazing way to be able to do that. And the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library really gives you some great resources being able to do that. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies for the weekly preaching, along with a lot of different events and different ideas and things to be thinking about within the environmental crisis and different ecological issues. So, if you enjoy listening to this podcast week after week for a half an hour, I know you're going to enjoy the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication, and that'll be the first link down in the resources section of the show notes. Being in the United States of America as I am bringing you this podcast, there is a couple things that I have been kind of thinking about and has been kind of swirling around in my head the last few days, and I think it kind of plays into these texts this week. Because I would argue with where we'll be going, it's not necessarily the easiest sermon to listen to, much like what Jesus gives us this week. I'd also argue it's not necessarily things that, especially as Americans, but also people worldwide, really want to hear. And that is, we have some things we need to work on environmentally, period. End stop. And I think that's something at times that can feel overwhelming, overbearing, but I think it's also one of these things where, especially using the Hebrew text this week, can help us give some encouragement on why we need to keep going even when it's difficult. So let's talk about a few different things here. One of the things that I have been thinking about a little bit, my wife really likes documentaries, and for various different reasons, she has been following some of these Hurricane Katrina documentaries that are coming out since that happened 20 years ago at the end of the month. And it's kind of crazy to think about. It's been also one of these things where there was a lot of collapses of systems and various different things that were going on there. But one of the things was the levees wasn't ready for the type of water, and they caused leaking, which then exacerbated the already difficult situation that New Orleans was going through in 2005 with Katrina. But I think it's also, as we are watching one of these documentaries, going through how, yes, there has been some things that were not handled well by the government, but it's also the aspect of when we're looking at that catastrophe now. And we were watching one that was coming from National Geographic and talking about how in the last 10 years, we are getting more and more of these catastrophes that are devastating and how difficult that is. Now, granted, there were certain sections of New Orleans that were able to take certain things to try to help be more preventative for future storms coming in, but it's also this acknowledgement of things that are changing and we're having a lot more of these dramatic storms happening. And it gets into something else that I actually ended up experiencing last week, and I'll attach a resource down below. And this might be something worth going through with the community. I didn't do it in the way that it was recommended, but it's this thing called theweek.oo. And they go through, and they're about 3 1-hour videos that go through pretty succinctly a lot of the different issues and what some of the ramifications could be, and also getting our heads around the idea when we're getting a lot of these climate scientists who are saying, oh, all this stuff is going to happen in 2050. Recognizing first and foremost, now we are closer to 2050 than we are 2000. And this recognition on how we don't expect that to be really that far away in our lifetime. It's 25 years. And where will we expect ourselves to be? And especially the first episode that they have of these 3 episodes is really difficult. But one of the things that I felt that they did really, really well in this is then starting to give you hope and then seeing where some of the hope is happening to kind of encourage, we can do this type of thing. And we'll get into that a little bit further. But first and foremost, you have to acknowledge the crazy stuff that's going on environmentally. And especially the United States, I feel like at times we can kind of rub off on this and we ignore different sections of the world that are having more of these ecological issues that are happening, that statistically, because of the warming climate, you can credit a good section of it is due to how we are living, not how they are living. And that's the difficult thing is that we are directly affecting how they are living because of that. And especially when you're looking at the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere, it has been credited that the United States is roughly in the ballpark of about 25% of the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere is because of us. So that is another difficult aspect of things to be looking at. And another thing that we crossed over less than a month ago was Earth Overshoot Day, which is taking a calculation of utilizing the resources that we have as a world. Do we have enough year to year? If we were looking at a bank account and thinking about it, do we have enough to be able to make sure that this builds perpetually and we're able to? We're not doing that. This year, Earth's Overshoot Day was July 24th. Which is the soonest it's ever been. We keep moving closer and closer and closer. And with how we are consuming the Earth at this moment, it's 1.8 Earths. We are over consuming the planet. We are putting more strain on the planet than it can able to restore and regenerate, thus making it difficult for us to be able to continue to live in the way that we are expecting, because we are going to run out of things. And especially as we keep then perpetuating some of these problems, as the Earth then isn't able to restore itself, we actually make it harder and harder and harder. And we get to, like we are playing a game of Kaput, which was a game where you had all these sticks and you have marbles on top and you keep pulling them and trying to limit the number of marbles. But at some point, you pull the wrong stick and everything collapses. And I think this is where we're getting to, where we have to acknowledge the way that we have been doing things isn't working, and it's not going to work. And especially if we are a world that we're trying to care for people on the planet outside of even just wherever country we're in, we then have to start acknowledging where we're falling short. Heck, even within the United States, I would argue there's ways that we are falling short and we are seeing things that are happening and we keep shrugging it off like it's no big deal. I'll take another example. I have family that lives in Arizona. Last September, we were down there and they were having record high heats of nearly 120. It was like 115, 117 at the end of September last year. This year, this last week in August, they had the hottest temperatures they have ever had in August in Phoenix. The problem is perpetually getting worse year after year after year. If you look through the meteorological data, we are continually having the hottest year, the hottest year, the hottest year, the hottest year, the hottest year. And that makes it more and more difficult. We don't understand where is the tipping point where suddenly you made things and everything that we expect no longer works. I think when we start thinking about it from that context and we start looking at the last couple verses that Jesus has in this gospel, that we recognize when there's clouds in the west that there's rain coming, and that when they have winds from the south that their warm air is coming up. But yet you interpret things on earth, but you don't know how to understand the present time. You understand how the appearance of things are right now, but you don't understand how that is affecting things right now. We're in a difficult situation with our environment. If we don't drastically change things, the way in which we've been accustomed to living is not going to be possible. It's just not. The earth is going to change so much that we won't be able to predict things like we used to. And there's so many things that are dependent on different aspects that we as scientists don't fully understand all of them. We understand a good section of them. We don't understand all of them. And to suddenly have that disappear could make things really, really difficult. We like having that security. We like having that understanding. But it's difficult. It's difficult to walk out in faith and to change how we are doing things. It's difficult to walk out and say, I'm not 100% sure how this is going to work, but we're going to have to do it. But yet, when we talk about the faith that we believe in, that's what the Israelites did multiple times. When they left Egypt, they didn't understand where they were going. They didn't understand what was next. They just had trust that God was going to carry them through. As we are looking at that, we need to drastically change how we do agriculture, how we are consuming and utilizing natural resources in general, thinking about how do we do energy in general. These are scary things because we have gotten so accustomed to doing things in a certain way. But one of the things that I really enjoyed that the week brought up is that the world has gone through these types of transformations before, and actually in fairly quick succession. One of the great examples that they brought up from history was if we go back a couple centuries, the idea of having monarchs over countries, what we now know as countries, was very common. There was the idea that there was the ruling class and there was everybody else. And that we were just kind of part of it. We were part of the system. We were part of this hierarchy that we didn't get to choose whether we were the top or the bottom. We were just in it. And then you had the French Revolution that kind of changed the whole thing, and it began in motion this whole movement toward what we have now in much of the world as democracy. Now, is democracy perfect? No. But I would also argue democracy is a lot better than just having this random selected chosen class to rule everything. I would argue that's much better than that. And it happened in fairly fast succession within the world that suddenly all these countries were moving toward these democracies and the falling of kings and kingdoms. We're needing that on a global scale with how we're going to take care of the earth today. We've had the warning signs. And I think that's where when I read what Jesus is calling out, you guys aren't understanding these storms keep coming and yet you're not understanding that things are changing and you're not doing anything. What are you going to do about that? And it's not just going to be that we pray to God. There's action. There's faith that has to happen. The faith to walk around the walls of Jericho. The faith to go out and do something that seems crazy to do. But recognizing that this is something that God is calling us into doing. We have to recognize that we have been given a garden and we are producing sour grapes. And the thing is, the grapes have been getting sourer and sourer and sourer year after year after year, and we don't want to admit it. If we're taking like the Isaiah text, we don't want to admit that the wine that we are getting from the vineyard is getting worse and worse and worse. And it means that we have to burn it down and start anew. We have to then take what we know and for the most part recognize that that needs to be let go of. And as we as people struggle with that idea, we struggle with the idea of letting go of certain aspects of things. We want to hold on even when God is then saying, no, I have something better, but you have to trust me. Jeremiah's text even goes through how prophets have prophesied things, but yet we turn back. We turn away. We turn away from where God is calling us and say, no, we can't do this. This is more familiar. This seems easier. This seems like a good way of doing it. Recognizing that if we really thought about it, we know that what God is talking about is the better way of doing it. Folks, we know that there is one place that we are able to inhabit, and that is here on earth. We are now recognizing we are going through about 1.8 Earths of resources a year. Thus, the earth cannot replenish itself. We are also recognizing that the climate is warming and that the ways that we are doing things is not sustainable. But yet we say we got to keep moving forward with keep it as process as normal. Get back to what we were. Get back to this. The thing is, getting back to it is becoming impossible. Because what we are demanding of the earth isn't sustainable. This is quite radical when we think about it, that we are being told that we need to be able to look at situations and think complexly about how they are being talked to us and say we have to be able to recognize if this is not the way in which God is calling us, if this is not sustainable, then we have to turn away. The science continues to point more and more that there is a problem. And the question is, are we going to allow that problem to consume us? Or are we going to acknowledge the problem head on and turn and follow the Lord out of it? And that means it's not just praying our way through it. That means that we have to take action. The Israelites had to physically leave Egypt. They physically had to cross the Red Sea. They physically had to walk around Jerusalem. We have to physically acknowledge that there are certain things that we have to leave behind. It's not that we can never use those again, but we have to change our relationship with them. We have to physically think about and acknowledge new and different ways on how we are going to interact with our planet. And as I will be releasing soon, there's an interview that I go through and I talk through this type of thing. And I'm really excited for dropping that. Keep an eye out. There'll be an announcement coming really soon about this. But I think it's acknowledging yet again, we need to be doing this. There is no in the future. It's now. We have said that for too long. At what point do we acknowledge our sour grapes? At what point do we acknowledge that, yes, this is going to be difficult. Yes, this is going to be hard. Yes, this is going to ruffle feathers. Yes, this is going to change things dramatically and quickly. But in doing that, remember that when the people crossed the Red Sea and they watched the Egyptians get swallowed up by the Red Sea, they danced. There was a new freedom that was found there. As we are able to figure out and turn around and be able to live more in harmony with our planet, there will be a new freedom that is found. A new freedom to be able to work together, and a new freedom that allows us to be able to work more in harmony and acknowledge the planet and understand, I would argue, more of the creative and beauty of God in the way that God intended it to be understood. So the question I have for you this week is quite simple. What is something that you're going to do to change to help our planet? What is one thing that you're going to do to change to help our planet? We can't keep living the way that we are. We can't. It's not sustainable. And when we talk about our faith, we are trying to have a sustainable faith. We are trying to have a long-lasting faith. Then why are we looking at other parts of our life and think that that's the way of doing it? And I think when we understand and work on this concept, I would argue that we are actually going to get closer to God. Because I think because of how we have overconsumed things, we have started to understand and think that that's how we should live our life, is in this constant model of consume, consume, consume until I can't consume anymore. And I think that's where we fall short. I think that's when we miss the mark. I think that's when we miss what God is trying to actually show us. Because we have consumed so much, physically, metaphorically, with our time, our efforts, that we actually miss what God is trying to say. And actually, in our reduction of things, I think the voice of God becomes clear for us to understand. And in that moment, we will better understand more and more of who God is, and better be able to walk with God, because now we have turned and are walking with God. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be fast. We can do it all together. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.